The deed hit the table like a gunshot. Frances Barrett did not flinch. She stood in the doorway of the only home she had ever known, her dark hair loose around her shoulders, a rifle leveled at the chest of the tall stranger who had ridden up her lane not 10 minutes ago like he owned the place, which apparently was exactly what he believed. "You need to lower that weapon," the man said. His voice was low, unhurried, the kind of voice that had learned patience the hard way. He was standing in her yard with his hat in his hands, the late afternoon sun of a Kansas September burning gold behind him, and he was looking at her with those steady gray eyes like she was a problem he had not yet decided how to solve. "You need to get back on that horse," Frances said, "and ride away from my property before I help you do it." "That's the thing, ma'am." He set the deed on the porch railing between them, smoothing it flat with one broad hand. "It isn't your property anymore. Hasn't been, legally speaking, for about 3 weeks now." The words landed in her chest like a blade. She had been dreading this moment. She had been dreading it since she received the letter from the county clerk's office in Abilene, the one written in that cramped official hand telling her that her father's debts had been called in, that the Barrett ranch had been put up as collateral in a poker game she had not known about, and that the man who held the deed was coming to claim it. "My father had no right to gamble this land," she said. Her voice did not shake. She would not allow it to shake. "No, ma'am," the man agreed, and she hated him for agreeing because it meant he understood the injustice and intended to benefit from it anyway. "But the law says he did. The law." She said it the way a person says a word they have come to despise. "Chester Prescott," he said, introducing himself with a slight tilt of his head, the way men did out here when they were trying to be civil under circumstances that were not. "I rode down from Wichita. I don't have any desire to make this harder than it needs to be." "Then turn around." He looked at the rifle. He looked at her. He looked at the small house behind her, the garden she had planted herself, the apple tree her mother had put in the ground the year before she died, the smoke rising from the chimney, and she watched something complicated move through his expression, something she could not quite name. "I can't do that," he said quietly. "Then we have a problem, Mr. Prescott." "Yes," he said, "I suppose we do." That was how it had begun. But to understand why it mattered, why that moment on the porch with the rifle and the deed and the dying September light became the pivot point around which both their lives would turn, you have to go back a little further. You have to understand what Frances Barrett had survived to get to that porch, and what Chester Prescott had lost to get to that deed, and why neither of them was anywhere close to who the other assumed them to be. The Barrett Ranch sat on 320 acres of prime Kansas grassland just south of the Smoky Hill River, and Frances had lived on it for all of her 26 years. Her mother, Clara, had died of a fever when Frances was 11, and from that point forward it had been just her and her father, Edmund Barrett, a man of considerable charm and considerable weakness. Edmund had been a good farmer in the years when the bottle did not have him, and he had been a ruinous one in the years when it did. Frances had learned to compensate, learned to do the work of two people, learned to read the seasons and the soil and the market prices in Abilene with the same careful attention her father might have given them if his hands had been steadier and his nights had been quieter. By the time she was 20, she was running the ranch essentially alone. By 23, she had paid off the first of her father's debts from the cattle money she had earned the previous season. By 25, she believed the worst was behind them. She had been wrong. Edmund Barrett had died in April of 1879, and the manner of his dying had broken Frances in a way she did not yet fully understand. He had died not in his bed, not peacefully, but in the back room of a saloon in Abilene called the Silver Star, at a poker table, 3 sheets to the wind and owing more money than he had in cash. What he had in paper was the deed to his ranch, and in a moment of catastrophic clarity or catastrophic recklessness, or perhaps simple catastrophic desperation, he had put it in the pot. He had lost. The man who held his hand across the table was a professional gambler named Roy Decker, who collected the deed with the practiced ease of a man who had no intention of doing anything with it personally, but who understood very well that it had value. He had sold it within a week to a buyer he found through a land broker in Wichita. The buyer was Chester Prescott. Chester had not come to the purchase with villainous intentions. He had come to it with the intentions of a man who was 31 years old, who had spent the last decade working cattle drives from Texas to Kansas, who had saved every dollar he could lay hands on, and who had decided, with the quiet certainty of a man who has been moving his whole life and is finally ready to stop, that he wanted land of his own. He wanted to raise cattle. He wanted to build something that would outlast him. He had found the listing through the broker, had paid a fair price, and had ridden out to see what he had bought. He had not expected Frances. None of the paperwork had mentioned that there was a woman living on the property. The deed listed the land as unencumbered, the improvements listed as a house, a barn, a well, and an apple orchard, all of which had simply read to Chester as useful assets. He had pictured a vacant farmstead, maybe a little run down, maybe needing work. He had not pictured a woman with a rifle and dark eyes full of righteous fury, and a look on her face that told him she had been expecting this moment, and had been bracing for it with everything she had. He had not expected her to matter, but she did. From the first minute she mattered, and that was the dark secret Chester Prescott carried back with him to the small camp he made at the edge of the property that first night, under a sky full of stars, unable to sleep, staring up at the dark and listening to the wind in the grass and thinking about the way she had looked at him with that rifle in her hands, not afraid, not backing down, just absolutely, entirely, magnificently refusing. He had purchased a camp cot and provisions in Wichita before riding out, planning to stay at the property while he assessed its condition and made plans. He had not planned on staying in a camp at the edge of his own land because the woman who lived in the house had made it exceptionally clear that the house was hers and that his presence near it would be cause for action. He had believed her. In the morning he watered his horse, ate a cold breakfast of hardtack and dried beef, and walked back to the house. Frances answered the door before he could knock. "Still here," she observed. "Still here," he confirmed. He held up a hand to show it was empty. "I'm not here to fight, I'd like to talk. We talked yesterday. We pointed a rifle at each other yesterday. I'm not sure that counts." She looked at him for a long moment. The morning light was gentler than the afternoon had been, and it did something softer to the angles of her face, though her expression was no softer for it. She was a striking woman, not in the way that the women in the saloons were striking, not decorated or arranged for the purpose of being looked at, but striking the way the land was striking, something honest and uncompromising and entirely itself. "Say what you have to say," she told him. "I paid a fair price for this land," Chester said. "I paid it to a broker in Wichita who bought it from a gambler named Roy Decker who won it from your father in a card game. I didn't know you were here. I didn't know the circumstances. If I had known that a woman was living on it alone, I might have." He stopped. "You might have what?" she asked, and there was a hard, testing edge in the question. "I don't know," he admitted, because he genuinely did not. "But I know what I know now." "What you know now," she said, "is that this is my home, that I have lived here my entire life, that I have kept this land working while my father drank away every other asset he had. That the deed my father put in that pot was not his to wager because he wouldn't have had this land at all if not for the labor I put into it for 15 years. Every word she said was true. Chester felt each one land with the weight of truth. "None of that changes the legal reality," he said, and he hated saying it. "Then the legal reality is wrong." "Yes," he said simply, "it is." She stared at him. That was not what she had expected him to say. "I still own it," he added carefully. "The law still says I own it, but I'm willing to listen to what you're proposing because I can see that walking away is not something you're prepared to do, and I'd rather find a solution than spend the rest of my life fighting with you." "I'm not proposing anything," Frances said. "I'm telling you that I'm not leaving. Whatever you do with that information is your business. You understand that I could have the sheriff out here." Sheriff Aldridge has known me since I was 6 years old, she said. He will not be enthusiastic about removing me. Chester almost smiled. He stopped himself. All right, let me be direct with you. I have a legal deed to this property. I intend to run cattle on it. I need someone who knows this land to work it with me. You clearly know this land better than anyone. I'd like to propose an arrangement. Frances's eyes narrowed. What kind of arrangement? A working one. I'll be plain. I'm not asking you to leave. I'm asking you to consider working this ranch with me on a formal basis. I'll pay wages, fair wages, and you keep your home. When the ranch turns a profit, we discuss a proper agreement about the land. The silence that followed was the kind that had weight and texture. A meadowlark called somewhere in the grass beyond the fence. The wind moved through the apple tree and set the leaves shivering. You think I'm going to work for you, Frances said. I think you're going to tell me what you really think of that proposal, Chester said. What I really think, she said slowly, is that you are trying to turn a theft into a business arrangement and call it fair dealing. That's one way to see it. It's the accurate way. The accurate way, Chester said, and this time he did not hold back the slight pull at the corner of his mouth, because the woman was sharp and she was right, and he respected both things even though they complicated his life considerably. Is that a man named Edmund Barrett wagered land he had no moral right to wager, lost it to a gambler, who sold it to me, who arrived here with a legal deed and found a situation that is not simple and is not comfortable and that I'm trying to handle with some decency. Now, I know what I own on paper. I'm asking what it would take to make this work for both of us. Frances was quiet for a moment. Then she said, "Come in then, I'll make coffee." It was not agreement. It was not surrender. But it was the door opening, and Chester Prescott, who had learned on a dozen cattle drives that the first step through a difficult opening was the one that mattered most, stepped through it. The inside of the house was as much Frances Barrett as the outside, which meant it was clean and practical and unexpectedly lovely in small ways that did not announce themselves. The kitchen was well organized, the shelves stocked. There was a reading chair near the window with a book left open on the arm of it, and the book was not a novel or a Bible, but a volume on soil management that Chester recognized, because he had read it himself the previous winter. There were dried herbs hanging from the ceiling beams, and a calendar on the wall marked with planting dates and weather notations. This was the home of someone who took the work seriously, someone who understood the land not as a possession, but as a living thing to be tended. She set a pot on the cast-iron stove and ground coffee beans with a small hand mill, and she did it all with the economical efficiency of someone who had been doing these things alone for a long time. Chester sat at the kitchen table and looked out the window at the land beyond. "How long have you been here alone?" he asked. "My mother died when I was 11. My father was not what I would call present so. Effectively, most of my life. You ran this ranch by yourself." "I ran it with my father's name on the paperwork," she said, "which is the way things work out here, as I'm sure you understand." He did understand. He had seen it 100 times on the trail, women doing work that did not get credited to them because the law and the custom and the habit of the country assigned the credit to the man whose name was on the door. "There are 320 acres here," she said, bringing 2 cups to the table. "South pasture is best for grazing. The creek runs year-round even in dry summers. The soil in the north field is clay-heavy, but the east field is excellent. And if you intend to run cattle, you'll need to reinforce the fence line along the river bend before spring because the banks flood in April and the current posts are rotting." Chester blinked. He had not asked. She had simply told him because it was relevant, and because she was not the kind of woman who withheld useful information out of pride. "You know this land," he said. "I know every inch of it," she said. "I know where the water table runs low, and I know which sections of the south pasture have wire grass that will make cattle sick if they graze it unchecked. I know that the barn roof needs 3 new boards on the west side before winter, and that the well runs cleaner if you pull the rope on the left side, because the right pulley has a burr that drags sediment." She sat down across from him and wrapped both hands around her cup and looked at him with those dark eyes that were simultaneously guarded and entirely honest, and he felt the distinct and unsettling sensation of understanding something he had not been prepared to understand. "You're telling me I need you," he said. "I'm telling you that the land needs someone who knows it," she said carefully. "That happens to be me." "All right." He set down his cup. "Here is what I'm prepared to offer, and I mean this as a serious proposal, not a negotiating position. I will pay you a wage equivalent to what a hired ranch hand would make, which is $30 a month plus room and board, which means the house remains yours to live in. In addition, I will put in writing that if after 2 full working seasons the ranch is profitable, we will negotiate a proper land agreement that gives you a meaningful stake." Frances studied him. "Why would you do that?" "Because it's fair." "Men don't generally do things because they're fair," she said. "Not to women." "No," he agreed. "They don't. I'm telling you I intend to be the exception." "That's a very fine thing to say," she told him. "Fine words are not collateral." What would be collateral? She thought about it. He could see her thinking, see the precision of it, the way her mind worked through the angles the way his did, and he felt again that strange, unsettling sensation of recognition. "Put it in writing," she said at last. "A formal agreement. The wages, the terms, the land negotiation clause. Have it witnessed and notarized in Abilene. If you're willing to do that, then I'm willing to try your arrangement." "Done," Chester said, and he meant it. She looked at him like she was waiting for the catch. He let her look. "You're either a very decent man," Frances said slowly, "or a very clever one." "I've been called both," Chester said. "I'd like to be the first one." The agreement was drafted, written into Abilene, notarized by a clerk named William Foss, who raised his eyebrows at the arrangement but said nothing, and returned to the ranch by the end of that week. Frances signed it and Chester signed it, and they each kept a copy, and then they went to work. The first month was an education for both of them. Chester had spent a decade on cattle drives, which meant he knew cattle, knew horses, knew weather and distance, and the kind of hard physical labor that the range required. What he did not know was settled farming, did not know the rhythms of a fixed operation, the particular demands of maintaining land rather than moving across it. He made mistakes, and Frances caught them without cruelty but without softening the correction either. He had put the new fence posts in the wrong depth for the clay soil, and she told him plainly that they would heave when the ground froze and thawed. He had underestimated the amount of feed needed to carry the 4 horses through winter, and she walked him through her records, the careful notations she had kept for years, and showed him the math. He listened. That was the thing that Frances noticed first about Chester Prescott, the thing that separated him from every other man she had dealt with in a professional capacity, which was that he listened. He did not listen in the way men sometimes did, nodding and waiting for the woman to finish so they could explain why she was wrong. He listened the way she listened, fully, taking the information in, turning it over, incorporating it. "You didn't argue with me about the fence posts," she said one evening after supper in the 3rd week of the arrangement. "You were right," he said simply. "Most men would have argued anyway. Most men would have had to pull the posts out in April," he said. "I'd rather avoid the work." She laughed, and it surprised her, the laugh, because she had not felt much like laughing in the months since her father's death, had not felt much like anything except working and worrying. But Chester Prescott said it with such dry matter-of-factness that it crept up on her, and the laugh came out before she could stop it, and she saw his face change when it did, saw something warm and startled move through his expression, there and gone in a moment. They settled into a routine. Frances managed the crops and the kitchen garden and the orchard, and Chester managed the cattle and the physical maintenance of the structures. And between them, they planned the operations of the ranch with a collaborative efficiency that surprised them both. They ate supper together most evenings, because there was only the one kitchen and it made no sense to do otherwise, and these evenings became the part of the day that Chester found himself thinking about during the working hours in a way that he did not initially examine too closely. She was not easy to know. She was not warm in the way that women were supposed to be warm, not soft-spoken or deferential or quick to smile. She had edges, sharp ones, built from a life that had required her to be harder than her years should have demanded. But the more he came to know those edges, the more he understood that they were not the whole of her, that there was underneath them a person of extraordinary depth and humor and fierceness, a person who felt things strongly and expressed them precisely, and who was, in ways he had not expected, one of the most interesting people he had ever sat across a table from. The dark past that lived in the shadows of her eyes was something she did not speak about directly, but Chester was patient and observant, and he pieced it together over weeks of supper conversations and working hours, the small revelations that came out not as confessions but as practical context, the way she mentioned once that her father had sometimes frightened her when he drank, the way she described the year she had been 17, and a late frost had killed the crops, and she had gotten them through the winter on what she could preserve and what she could trade with neighbors, the quiet, fierce pride and the deep exhaustion both present in the telling. He had a dark past of his own, though he was slower to surface it. It came out in mid-October, on a night when the first real cold had come down from the north, and they had built a fire in the sitting room, and Frances had offered him a chair by it rather than sending him to the small room off the barn where he had been sleeping since their arrangement began. The room was warm and the fire was pleasant, and there was a companionable silence between them that had been growing more comfortable over the weeks, and Chester found himself saying something he had not planned to say. "I had a ranch once before," he said. Frances looked up from the mending she was doing. "What happened to it?" "Lost it," he said. "Not at cards, to a bank." He paused. "I was 23. My father and I had built it together over 3 years in southern Texas. We had 160 acres, a good herd started. My father died of pneumonia the 4th winter and the bank called the loan early. Said there was a provision in the original agreement, some buried language I hadn't read carefully enough." His jaw tightened with the memory. "I fought it. Spent every dollar I had on a lawyer in San Antonio." "Lost? That's why you read the deed so carefully," Frances said, not a question. "I read everything carefully now," he said, "the hard way." She was quiet for a moment. Then, carefully, she said, "Is that why you included the land negotiation clause? Because you know what it is to lose land you built?" He met her eyes across the firelight. "Partly. What's the other part?" The question was direct, the way she was direct about everything, and Chester found himself in the unusual position of not being sure he was ready to answer it honestly. Because the honest answer was that the other part was her, was the look on her face when she stood on that porch with the rifle, was the recognition he had felt sitting across from her at the kitchen table with the deed between them, was something that had been growing in the weeks since then, and that he was not yet certain what to do with. "I believe in fair dealing," he said, which was true as far as it went. Frances looked at him a moment longer than was strictly necessary, and then she returned to her mending, and the fire crackled between them, and Chester Prescott looked at the side of her face in the warm light and understood, with the sudden clarity of a man who has been avoiding a truth and has just run out of room to avoid it, that he was in serious trouble. October turned to November, and with the cold came the work of preparing the ranch for winter, which was relentless and physical, and left both of them exhausted at the end of each day. They worked well together with a kind of wordless coordination that had developed without either of them designing it. Chester would start a task and Frances would finish it, or vice versa, and there was an efficiency to their pairing that was satisfying in a way that went beyond the practical. There was also, increasingly, the other thing. It was not something either of them was ready to name. It existed in the longer looks and the careful distances they kept, and the moments when their hands brushed in the course of work and both of them felt it and neither of them mentioned it. It existed in the fact that Chester had begun, without ever deciding to, saving the interesting things he encountered during the day to tell her at supper, and in the fact that Frances had begun, without ever deciding to, listening for the sound of his horse in the yard in the late afternoon. It was complicated by the situation. The situation was the original complication, the layered injustice of how Chester had come to own this land, the power differential embedded in the arrangement, the fact that Frances's home and livelihood were still technically contingent on his goodwill even with the written agreement in place. She was not stupid about this. She understood that the law was the law, that the arrangement was a kindness that could theoretically be revoked, and that allowing herself to feel anything for the man who held her deed was the kind of trap that women in her situation walked into and did not always walk out of. She was wary of the trap. She watched for the hidden motive. She waited for the moment when the kindness would reveal itself as a calculation. It did not come. In the second week of November, a man rode up the lane on a black horse with a silver concho on his saddle, and Frances felt her stomach drop before he even dismounted, because she recognized the horse, and she recognized the man, and she knew that his arrival meant trouble of the worst kind. His name was Roy Decker. He was the gambler who had won the deed from her father. He was a lean man of around 40, with a gambler's careful eyes and a gambler's careful smile, and he had ridden from Abilene with a story that he delivered smoothly and pleasantly, and that was, Frances understood immediately, almost entirely false. Chester came in from the south pasture while Decker was still talking to Frances on the porch, and he read the situation with the instinct of a man who had been reading dangerous situations for a decade. "Prescott," Decker said, extending his hand. "I've been explaining to the young lady here that there's been a development, a legal one. Seems there's a question about the validity of the sale." Chester shook the hand without warmth. "What kind of question?" "The kind that requires we return to Abilene and speak with the county clerk." Decker's smile never wavered. "I'd hate for there to be any legal confusion about the ownership of this property." "There is no legal confusion," Chester said. "I have a notarized deed." "Well now, that's the interesting thing." Decker reached into his coat and produced a paper which he unfolded with the practiced ease of a man who had done this before. "It seems there was already a lien on the Barrett property when it was put up as collateral, a prior claim, which would mean that Barrett couldn't have wagered it free and clear, and I couldn't have sold it free and clear, and your deed may have what we might call a cloud on it." Chester took the paper and read it. Frances watched his face. It was very still, very controlled, and she had learned enough about him in these weeks to know that the stillness was not indifference but concentration. "Where did this lien come from?" he asked. "A creditor named Hanson. He had a note from Edmund Barrett going back to 1875. "And this creditor Hanson," Frances said, "is he willing to come forward and testify to this lien in court?" Decker looked at her. Something shifted in his careful eyes. "He might be." "Or," Frances said, keeping her voice very steady, "he might be someone you found who is willing to create the appearance of a prior claim so that you can either get this land back yourself or extract payment from Mr. Prescott to make the claim go away." The silence that followed was the particular silence of a man who has been accurately described. "That's a serious accusation," Decker said. "It's a serious situation," Chester said. His voice had dropped to something quiet and hard. "You'll want to hear my position on this matter clearly, Mr. Decker. I know lawyers in Wichita, I know the circuit judge, and I have a notarized deed of sale on which your signature appears. If you pursue a fraudulent lien claim, you will not enjoy the outcome. I suggest you take your cloud and ride back to Abilene." Decker looked between them for a long moment. Then his smile returned, thinner now, less pleasant. "I see how it is," he said. He folded the paper back into his coat. "Enjoy your property, Prescott." He rode away down the lane without looking back. Frances stood very still on the porch until he was out of sight. Then she sat down on the top step and put her hands on her knees and let out a long, slow breath. Chester sat down beside her, Not close, leaving a proper distance, but beside her. He won't let it go, she said. Men like that don't let things go. He sold this land believing he might be able to get it back. It's too valuable a play. I know, Chester said. He'll find a lawyer who'll file the lien claim regardless of how fraudulent it is. It'll tie up the deed in court for months, maybe longer. Probably. She turned to look at him. Why are you so calm? Because I've been through this before, he said, and I know that panicking doesn't help anything. He paused. I told you I had a ranch in Texas that I lost to a bank. What I didn't tell you was what I learned from it. I learned everything there was to learn about land law in the state of Kansas before I purchased this property. I anticipated exactly this kind of move. I have correspondence with 3 lawyers in Wichita, and I have a relationship with the circuit judge who serves this district. I'm not unprotected. Frances stared at him. You prepared for this. I prepared for the possibility of it. You knew when you bought this land that someone might try to run a fraudulent lien claim against it. I knew that land of this value, purchased in circumstances like these, might attract that kind of attention, yes. He met her eyes. I want you to understand something. I did not come here to exploit a situation. I came here because I wanted land. But I'm not naive about what that means, and I'm not unprepared. The revelation settled over her like something she wanted to argue with and couldn't. He had planned carefully. He had protected himself. He had, she realized, also protected her, because if his title was solid, her arrangement with him was solid. You're more complicated than you look, she said. I get that a lot, he said, and the dry humor was enough to break the tension. And she laughed again, and this time she did not try to stop it. They rode into Abilene the following week, Chester and Frances together, and Chester met with his lawyer, a careful, older man named Edmund Howell, who reviewed the situation and confirmed that the lien claim Decker had produced was based on a debt that had been settled in 1877 and had no standing. Howell filed the appropriate documentation to have the claim officially rejected, and he did so with a speed and confidence that told Frances he had been prepared for precisely this scenario. While Howell worked, Frances went to the dry goods store and then to the post office, and when she came back to the street where Chester was waiting with the horses, she found him in conversation with a woman she recognized. The woman's name was Clara Hewitt, and she ran the millinery, and she was a prodigious source of information about the affairs of Abilene and its surrounds. Frances watched from a slight distance as Clara Hewitt spoke to Chester with a particularity of attention that was not purely professional, and she felt something move through her chest that she identified after a moment as jealousy, and the identification of it was so surprising that she stopped walking entirely for a moment in the middle of the street. She was jealous, over Chester Prescott. The realization was like stepping into cold water, shocking and clarifying all at once. She walked the rest of the way to the horses with her face composed, and her heart a small revolution. On the ride home, they were quieter than usual, and the quiet had a different texture to it than the comfortable working silences they had developed, a charged quality, the kind of quiet that precedes a storm or a conversation. The Kansas sky was enormous above them, the prairie winter pale gold and silver to every horizon, and the horses moved steadily along the road south, while Frances turned things over in her mind with the same methodical attention she gave to soil composition and fence posts. You're quiet, Chester observed, about 20 minutes outside of Abilene. I'm thinking, she said, about Decker. No, he let the silence stand for a moment. About anything you want to talk about. She considered the question, the careful openness of it, the way he left space without pushing into it, and she thought about all the reasons she had cataloged for not feeling what she was beginning to feel, the power differential, the trap, the hidden motive she had been watching for, and she thought about all the evidence she had gathered in 2 months of working beside this man, the way he listened, the way he dealt fair, the way he had ridden into Abilene prepared to protect a deed that was also, effectively, protecting her. The way he had sat beside her on the porch step after Decker rode away, not touching, just present. I need to ask you something, she said, All right. Why did you include the land negotiation clause? I told you because it's fair. And the other part, she said. You said partly. Chester rode for a moment without speaking. Then, with the decision of a man who has made up his mind to be honest, he said, because I didn't want you to leave. The words were quiet and plainly said, and she felt them in her chest. You'd known me for 3 days when you wrote that clause, she said. I know, he said. That surprised me too. She looked at him. He was looking forward down the road, the reins easy in his hands, his profile against the winter sky, and she could see in the set of his jaw that the admission had cost him something, and that he was not going to take it back. Chester, she said. He looked at her. Don't mistake me for someone who's easily persuaded by fine words or warm feelings, she said. I have been managing this life on my own for a long time, and I am not looking to put myself in someone else's hands. I know that, he said. And I have not made up my mind about you. I know that too. But, she said carefully, I am not unaware of what you just said, and I am not going to pretend otherwise. He held her gaze for a moment, and in that moment something settled between them, some kind of agreement without words, an acknowledgement of the thing that had been growing in the house and the yard and the supper table evening since September. Neither of them reached for it yet, but both of them knew it was there. That's enough for now, Chester said. Yes, she agreed. It is. They rode the rest of the way home in a quiet that was different from the charged silence before, calmer and warmer, carrying the weight of something acknowledged. December came, and with it the hard work of winter maintenance, the endless tending of the stove, the checking of the cattle in the cold, the repairs that had to be made before the serious weather set in. The lien claim was officially dismissed in the 3rd week of November, and Howell sent word that Decker had moved on from Abilene and was believed to be in Dodge City, which meant the immediate threat had passed, though both Chester and Frances kept their guard, because men like Roy Decker had a way of not staying moved on. The ranch work continued, and the evenings continued, and the thing between them continued to grow with the unhurried persistence of something that was not going to be argued away. One evening in mid-December, Frances brought out a bottle of whiskey her father had kept for company and poured 2 small glasses and set one in front of Chester at the kitchen table and sat across from him, and he looked at her and said, "What's the occasion?" "I was going to say it's been 3 months," she said, "and we haven't killed each other, which I think merits a small acknowledgement. I believe you were the only one in danger of killing anyone when I arrived," he said. "I had good reason," she said. "You had excellent reason," he said. He raised his glass. "To excellent reasons." She raised hers, and they drank, and the whiskey was warm, and the fire was warm, and the kitchen was warm with the particular warmth of a space that 2 people have made together over time. That is not any one person's warmth, but the warmth of the combination. "Tell me something," Frances said. "What did you imagine before you came, before you knew I was here? What did you picture?" Chester thought about it. "I pictured a quiet life," he said. "I had done nothing but move for 10 years. I wanted something I could build and stay with." He paused. "I pictured mornings that were mine, a herd that grew. Land that improved under my hands." Another pause. It was a fairly solitary picture. "And now," he looked at her directly, "now it's better." Frances felt the warmth of the whiskey, and the warmth of the fire, and the warmth of the way he said it, simply and without the self-consciousness that lesser men would have brought to it. And she thought about the life she had been living, the long solitary years, the work that went unacknowledged, the loneliness she had never permitted herself to name because naming it would have required acknowledging how much it hurt. And she thought about the last 3 months, which had been the hardest and strangest of her life, and also, she realized, the least lonely. "Chester," she said. "Frances," he said. She reached across the table and laid her hand over his, and he turned his hand over and held hers, and they sat there in the firelight of the kitchen of the house that was both of theirs now in some way that the deed did not capture and the law had not yet recognized. And outside the wind was moving across the Kansas plains, and the stars were enormous in the cold December sky, and it was enough. It was, for that moment, exactly enough. But the world outside the kitchen did not stay quiet. Roy Decker had, as Frances suspected, not simply moved on. What he had moved on to was a more sophisticated version of his original scheme, and by January of 1880, he had found himself a lawyer in Wichita, a man named Caldwell Pierce, who was known in certain circles for his willingness to pursue legally creative strategies on behalf of paying clients. And together, they had constructed a claim that was more difficult to dismiss than the initial lien attempt. The new claim arrived in the second week of January by official post. It asserted that the original poker game in which Edmund Barrett had lost the deed had involved cheating on the part of Roy Decker, which meant that the deed transfer had been obtained through fraud, which meant that the sale to Chester Prescott was also tainted, which meant that the entire chain of title was potentially void, and that under Kansas law, contested title reverted to the estate of the original owner, Edmund Barrett's estate, which, with no surviving will, would pass to his daughter. Frances read the document 3 times, standing in the kitchen in the January cold, and then she set it down on the table and looked at Chester. "He's claiming he cheated my father," she said, "in order to get the land back. In order to put the title in dispute," Chester said carefully. "If the title is disputed and the land reverts to your father's estate, he's betting that you won't be able to maintain a legal claim against him while also maintaining the operations of the ranch. He wants you both fighting each other and fighting him at the same time." "He's trying to set us against each other," Frances said. "Yes," Chester said. "That's the hidden motive. He doesn't care about the land as much as he cares about the disruption. He's going to offer to settle, eventually, for a price. He's using me as a weapon against you." "He's trying to," Chester said, "but only if we let him." He said it with such steady certainty, and she looked at him across the table, and she understood what he was saying, understood that the answer to Roy Decker's scheme was the thing she had been slow to name and slower still to claim, the thing that had been building in the evenings and the silences and the moment on the road outside Abilene and the night by the fire with the whiskey glasses. "What are you suggesting?" she asked. Chester was quiet for a moment. He folded his hands on the table. He looked at her with the direct, honest attention that she had come to know as his particular way of approaching things that mattered. "I'm going to say something," he said, "and I want you to understand that I'm saying it because I mean it, not because of Decker. The Decker situation makes it timely, but it's not the reason." Frances waited. "Marry me," he said. The silence was the kind that stretches. "If we're married," he continued, "jointly owning the property by right of marriage, Decker's claim dissolves completely. Your father's estate, your interest in the land, my deed, all of it consolidates. He has no play." "That's the practical argument," Frances said. "Yes," he said. "And the other argument is that I have been in love with you since approximately the 3rd day I was on this property, when you showed me your soil records and told me I had set the fence posts wrong. And the only thing that has prevented me from saying so sooner is that I didn't want you to think I was using it as a tactic." Frances looked at him for a long time. "You're asking me to marry you," she said. "I am. A man who came here and told me he owned my home." "Yes." "Who I pointed a rifle at." "That's accurate." "Who I have been living with in a state of armed neutrality for 4 months. Armed neutrality is one way to describe it," he said. "I would describe it differently." "How would you describe it?" "As the best 4 months of my life," he said simply. Frances stood up from the table and walked to the window and looked out at the January land, the brown grass and the bare trees and the pale sky. And she thought about her mother's apple tree in the yard and her father's catastrophic weakness, and the 15 years of labor that had gone uncredited, and the rifle she had leveled at a stranger's chest, and the supper table evenings, and the way she had felt sitting beside him on the porch step after Decker rode away. Not alone, not carrying it alone. She thought about what she wanted. She had spent so long not permitting herself to want things that did not directly involve the survival of the ranch that the exercise of naming a want that was purely her own felt strange and dangerous, and also, underneath all the caution, clarifying. She turned back to Chester Prescott, who was sitting at her kitchen table waiting for her with the patient attention of a man who was prepared to hear any answer she gave him. "I will not be a wife in the way that means I stop being what I am," she said. "I will not stop managing this land. I will not become decorative. I will not pretend to know less than I know or to care less than I care." "I would be horrified if you did," he said. "And the land will be jointly held. Not mine deferred to yours, not yours with my name on it. Joint, equal." "I already put it in writing," he said. "I just need your answer to change the document." She walked back to the table and stood across from him and looked at him carefully one last time, looking for the hidden thing, the dark motive, the calculation she had been waiting for through 4 months of vigilance. She did not find it. What she found was Chester Prescott, who was honest and patient and capable of sitting still with difficulty and disagreement without trying to eliminate them, who had learned from loss and had not let it make him hard, who had ridden up her lane with a legal deed and had then, when confronted with a reality more complicated than the paperwork, had tried to do the right thing, the actually right thing, not the legal thing, not the convenient thing, but the thing that was right. "Yes," she said. He stood up. "Yes," she said again, more quietly, like the word settling. He came around the table to her, and she let him take her hands, and they stood in the kitchen of the house they had been sharing for 4 months, and he looked down at her with those steady gray eyes, and she looked up at him, and something that had been holding itself carefully in check in her chest released, quietly, entirely, without drama, like a door that has been shut a long time finally opening onto sun. He kissed her once, gently, and she kissed him back with the directness that characterized everything about her, and the January wind moved against the windows and did not get in. They were married in Abilene on a Tuesday in February, 1880, at the county courthouse, witnessed by Edmund Howell the lawyer, and by a neighbor woman named June Hartley, who farmed 40 acres 2 miles east of the Barrett Ranch with her husband, and who had been one of the first people to call on Frances after Edmund Barrett's death, and who had become, over the preceding months, something like a friend to Frances, which was not a thing Frances had allowed herself many of. The ceremony was brief and legally precise, which suited both of them. Howell had prepared the revised property documents in advance and had them ready for signature immediately following the ceremony, which also suited both of them. The new deed read, "Chester Prescott and Frances Prescott, formerly Frances Barrett, joint tenants in common." Frances looked at it for a long time. "You can keep Barrett in your name if you want," Chester said quietly beside her. "I know," she said. She had thought about it. "Barrett is my mother's name as much as my father's," she said. "I want to keep it." So the deed was amended to read, "Chester Prescott and Frances Barrett Prescott." And Caldwell Pierce's legal challenge, when Howell filed the marriage certificate and the new deed with the county court, had nowhere to go. A creditor of Edmund Barrett's estate could not claim against property that had been transferred out of the estate by the legal marriage of the estate's sole heir. Decker's scheme dissolved in the paperwork of 2 people who had decided to be honest with each other, and Roy Decker, when he learned of it through Pierce, reportedly threw something heavy across a room in a Wichita hotel, and then went to the saloon and played cards until he had lost enough money to feel appropriately punished by the universe. No one felt sorry for him. Spring came to the Barrett Prescott Ranch with the kind of extravagant generosity that the Kansas plains produced after a hard winter, the grass coming up green and thick, the creek running full and clear, the apple tree putting out blossoms in the yard that Frances's mother had planted and Frances had tended, and that now shaded the porch of a house that contained 2 people instead of 1. They had 3 months of the quiet, good, complicated, particular life of 2 people learning to share space and will and daily existence. And it was not without friction, because they were both strong-minded, and both had opinions about the right way to do things, and both were accustomed to making decisions alone. But the friction was honest and navigated with the same directness that had characterized their arrangement from the beginning, and it produced more light than heat. Chester had put 20 head of longhorn cattle on the south pasture in March, purchased from a rancher outside of Wichita, and they were doing well on the spring grass. Frances had expanded the kitchen garden and put in a second apple tree alongside her mother's, which Chester had helped her plant on a March morning while the ground was still cold, and there had been something ceremonial about it that neither of them discussed but both of them felt. In April, June Hartley came to call and found Frances in the kitchen garden and told her, with the comfortable frankness of a woman who has delivered this kind of news before, that she believed Frances was expecting. Frances went very still among the bean rows. "You're not surprised," June said. "I'm surprised," Frances said. "I'm just processing the surprise quietly." She told Chester that evening after supper. She told him straight, the way she told him everything, watching his face while she did. His face did not do anything subtle or complicated. It did the one thing. It changed into something so openly glad that she felt her own chest expand with it, like her lungs had suddenly found more room. He took her hands and said, "Are you all right? Are you well?" "I'm perfectly well," she said. "I'm growing a person, which seems to require more sleep than I'm currently getting, but otherwise I'm fine." "Frances," he said, her name in his mouth sounding the way it had started to sound in the last months, like a word with specific gravity. "I know," she said. "I feel it too." The summer was full and good and busy. The cattle doing well. The crops coming in stronger than any year Frances had records for, partly because the weather had cooperated and partly because two capable people working a 320-acre ranch produced measurably better outcomes than one person working it alone. Chester brought in a hired man in July, a quiet young Swede from up near Salina named Anders, who was reliable and hardworking, and who addressed both Chester and Frances with equal professional deference, which Frances appreciated. The legal situation was fully resolved by June, the deed clean and undisputed in the county records, Roy Decker nowhere to be seen. Edmund Howell sent a final letter confirming the closure of all pending matters, and Chester read it aloud at the supper table and then folded it and put it in the deed box with the other papers. And Frances made coffee, and they drank it on the porch in the June evening with the fireflies beginning in the grass. And it was one of those moments that contained everything good without requiring anything of them beyond being present in it. In September of 1880, a year after Chester Prescott had ridden up the lane with a deed in his saddlebag and found a woman with a rifle in the doorway, their son was born. They named him Edmund, after Frances's father, because Frances had decided over the preceding months that her father's weakness did not cancel his existence, that a man who failed was still a man who had been present, who had taught her things, including some things he had not intended to teach her, including the importance of keeping her own records and the cost of depending on someone else's reliability. She carried his name forward with clear eyes, and Chester did not argue with her choice because it was her name to give or withhold, and he understood that. Edmund Prescott was born on a Thursday morning in a September not unlike the September 1 year before, the grass golden, the light long and amber, and he was loud about his arrival, and had his mother's dark hair and his father's gray eyes. And Frances, who had been relentless and practical all through the preceding months, looked at her son for the first time and was entirely undone, completely and without reservation. Which she had not expected, and which Chester observed with a tenderness that he kept mostly to himself, because he understood that she would prefer not to be observed in a moment of complete surrender, even a joyful one. He did not keep it entirely to himself. "You look," he said quietly when June Hartley had stepped out and it was just the three of them in the bedroom, "like someone who has just understood something." Frances looked up from the baby to him. "I understand a great many things differently than I did yesterday," she said. "Good things, I hope." "Terrifying things," she said, "that are also very good." She held out her free hand to him. "Come sit with us." He sat on the edge of the bed, and she leaned against him, and little Edmund Barrett Prescott, slept in the crook of her arm with the absolute confidence of someone who has just arrived in a place prepared for him. And the September light came through the window and fell across all three of them, warm and unhurried, and the apple tree in the yard was laden with fruit, and the cattle were on the south pasture. And the Kansas sky was big and blue, and entirely indifferent to the extraordinary things that were happening beneath it. The winters of 1880 and 1881 were hard ones, as winters in Kansas tended to be, and the work of keeping the ranch going through the cold was constant. But they had Anders and they had two good horses and they had each other. And the ranch was, as Frances had predicted in the agreement she had signed in September of 1879, profitable by the end of its second full working season. Chester brought the accounts to the kitchen table one February evening in 1881 and spread the ledger out and showed Frances the numbers, and she looked at them carefully and thoroughly, as she looked at everything, and said, "The east field did better than the south pasture this year in terms of value per acre." "I noticed," he said. "I think we convert another 20 acres in the east field next season." "Agreed, and we need a second well." "I was thinking the same thing." She looked up from the ledger at him. "We always think the same things." "Mostly," he said. "It's disconcerting," she said, but the way she said it was not a complaint. "It's efficient," he said. "Chester," she said. "Frances," he said. "This is a good life," she said, which for Frances Barrett Prescott was the equivalent of a declaration, was the thing she had been building toward through all the hard years and the lonely ones, through the 15 years of unacknowledged labor and the months of armed neutrality and the moment on the porch with the rifle and the deed between them. And she said it plainly and directly because that was how she said everything, and because she meant it absolutely. "It is," he said. He reached across the ledger and she met him halfway, her hand in his. The accounts of a prosperous joint enterprise spread out between them on the table of a house that was fully, legally, and in every other sense hers. The following spring, 1882, brought several things of note. The first was a letter from a land agent in Topeka who had heard of the Barrett Prescott operation and inquired whether they were interested in purchasing the adjacent 60 acres to the north, which the original holder had defaulted on. Chester and Frances spent 3 evenings talking through the numbers and the plans, and on the 4th evening they wrote back to the agent and made an offer, which was accepted. The Barrett Prescott Ranch was now 380 acres. The second thing 1882 brought was a visit from a young woman named Adeline Cho, who was the daughter of a Chinese railroad worker who had settled in Abilene after the line went through, and who ran a small printing shop with her father. Adeline had come to ask Frances whether she might be willing to contribute to a paper. Adeline was composing about women's property rights in Kansas, an issue that the state legislature was beginning to consider in light of the legal reforms being discussed in the eastern states. Frances spent an entire afternoon with Adeline at the kitchen table, telling her story plainly and completely, including the parts about her father's debt and the poker game and the legal arrangement and the marriage and the joint deed. And Adeline took careful notes in a small book and asked careful questions. And when she left, she told Frances that what she had built was important and that other women in similar situations needed to know that it was possible. Frances thought about that for a long time after Adeline rode away down the lane. "She's right," Chester said, when Frances told him about the conversation that evening. "It shouldn't have required me to be exceptionally stubborn and you to be exceptionally decent," Frances said. "The law should simply protect women's property rights the same as men's." "You're right," he said. "It should." He paused. "I expect it will eventually." "Eventually is a long time," she said. "Yes," he agreed. "It is." He looked at her across the supper table, this woman who had stood in a doorway with a rifle and refused to move, who had turned a forced choice into a different kind of choice entirely through the force of her own will and the precision of her own thinking. "You could write about it yourself, you know. You have the story." "I have a ranch to run," she said. But she did not say no. The third thing 1882 brought was that Frances was, by midsummer, expecting again, and this time the expectation sat differently, more settled, the terror of the first time replaced by something calmer, though no less profound. Edmund, who was nearly 2 and had inherited his father's solemnity and his mother's absolute refusal to be thwarted, greeted the news of an impending sibling by attempting to climb everything in the house at greater altitude than before, as if establishing prior claim. "He's going to be a handful," Chester observed. "He's going to be exactly like both of us," Frances said, "which will be completely fair as a consequence." The baby was born in January of 1883 in the same bedroom in the same January cold, and this time it was a girl, and Frances held her and looked at Chester and said, "Clara," without preamble, and Chester said, "For your mother." "Yes," Frances said. Clara Barrett Prescott arrived in the world with her mother's dark hair, and a temperament that would reveal itself over the coming months to be sunny and relentless in equal measure. And she was greeted by her brother with a mixture of suspicion and fascination that resolved over the following weeks into a devoted possessiveness that would characterize their relationship for years to come. June Hartley, who had been present for both births and who had become genuinely dear to Frances in the way that women who have shared significant moments become genuinely dear, looked at the four of them together in the bedroom and said, with the satisfaction of someone who has been watching a story proceed toward its right ending, "There it is." Frances looked at her. "What?" "What it was always supposed to be," June said simply, and she went to make coffee. And Frances looked at Chester, and Chester looked at Frances, and baby Clara looked at both of them with the grave attention of someone who has just arrived and is taking stock of the situation. And the January wind was outside, and the fire was warm, and the ledger in the kitchen showed 380 profitable acres, and the deed in the deed box showed 2 names, joint and equal. And Edmund was asleep down the hall with his collection of rocks and his small wooden horse, and it was theirs, all of it, thoroughly and completely and without reservation or cloud. Chester put his arm around Frances where she sat propped against the pillows, and she leaned into him, something she had done more often in 3 years than in all the decades before, this leaning, this allowing of support, this recognition that being held by someone who had earned the position was not weakness but its own kind of strength. "I was going to shoot you," she said thoughtfully. "I remember," he said. "I'm glad I didn't." "I share that sentiment," he said, very strongly. She laughed quietly so as not to wake Clara, and the laugh was the same one that had come out of her that evening in October when he had made the dry remark about the fence posts, the one that had surprised her, the one that had been the first crack in the careful reserve she had been maintaining, and it was still that laugh, still entirely hers, still surprising in how warm it was, and Chester felt it the same way he had felt it then, the thing in his chest that moved when she laughed. Unchanged by familiarity, not dulled by 3 years, but if anything brighter for having been proven true. The spring of 1883 was exceptionally fine. The new 60 acres in the north, which Frances had identified as suitable for a second orchard, had been put in over the preceding autumn with young apple trees purchased from a nursery in Lawrence, and they were putting out their first tentative growth in the April warmth. The south pasture was at 60 head of cattle, which was the number both Chester and Frances had identified as the right carrying capacity for the land without overgrazing, and Anders had been joined by a second hired man, a wiry, competent man from Missouri named George, and together the 4 of them kept the ranch running with the kind of organized efficiency that made it, by the assessment of any neighbor who passed through, one of the better-run operations in their part of Dickinson County. Roy Decker had not been heard from in over 2 years. His lawyer Pierce had moved to Denver. The deed was clean and had been clean for 3 years, and the county records were correct, and the whole dark episode of the fraudulent lien claim was simply history now, one of the layers of the story of this land, not forgotten but not determining. Frances did write about it in the end. Not a book, but a careful account, several pages long, of her experience with her father's debt and the land claim and the legal maneuver that had tried to take her home and the steps she had taken to protect it. She sent it to Adeline Cho, who included it in a pamphlet she compiled on women's property rights in Kansas, which circulated through several counties and eventually found its way into the hands of a state legislator who read it with interest. The legal landscape was slow to change. Frances had told Chester as much, but she had done what she could with the tools she had, which was what she had always done, and the doing of it was its own satisfaction. On a September evening in 1883, exactly 4 years after Chester Prescott had ridden up the lane with a deed in his saddlebag, they sat on the porch together in the same September light, the same amber gold burning low across the grass, and Edmund ran in the yard below them catching fireflies in a glass jar with the focused determination of a 3-year-old on a mission. And Clara sat in Frances's lap nursing with the placid contentment of someone who has no complaints about her arrangements, and Chester sat beside Frances with his long legs stretched out, and his boots dusty from the day's work and his coffee cooling in his hand, and the apple trees in the yard were heavy with fruit, both. The old one and the new one, Clara's and Frances's mothers, side by side. 4 years ago today, Frances said. Chester looked at her. Give or take, he said. Give or take, she agreed. She looked out at the land, at the sweep of grass going golden in the late light, at the fence lying solid in the clay soil correctly set. I was so angry when you rode up. You had every right to be. I was frightened too, she said. I wasn't going to show you that. I know, he said. That's what made you magnificent. She turned to look at him then, and the look between them carried everything. The rifle and the deed and the coffee in the kitchen and the poker game and the fire and the whiskey and the February courthouse and the contracts and the children and the land. 380 acres of it, jointly held, honestly run, built over 4 years of 2 people doing the most difficult and ordinary and extraordinary thing, which is to choose each other every day. Chester, she said. Frances, he said. I love you, she said directly, plainly, without decoration, the way she said everything that mattered. I know, he said. I've known since about the 3rd evening when you corrected my fence posts and showed me your soil records and then laughed at my own joke before I'd finished telling it. He paused. I love you too. I've been loving you since September of 1879, and I intend to continue indefinitely. Edmund, below them in the yard, caught a firefly in his jar and held it up with a shout of triumph, and Clara, disturbed by the noise, opened her eyes and then closed them again, deciding it was not her concern. And the Kansas sky was full of early stars, and the apple trees stood in the yard, and the cattle were quiet on the south pasture, and the deed in the deed box inside the house said Chester Prescott and Frances Barrett Prescott, joint tenants in common, and it was everything, and it was theirs. And it was enough, and it was more than enough. It was the whole of what either of them had ever truly wanted when they allowed themselves to want without fear. Chester put his arm around her on the porch where one September she had stood with a rifle, and she leaned into him under the same sky, and the evening came down soft and full over the Barrett Prescott ranch, and the light faded, and the fireflies came up in the grass, and inside the house the supper table was set, and the lamp was burning, and the deed box sat on the shelf, and the ledger was open to a page of numbers that told, in their patient columns, the story of a place that had been saved by stubbornness and decency, and the specific alchemy of 2 people who had been, against all probability, exactly right for each other. Edmund ran up the porch steps and crashed into his father's legs and held up the jar with both small hands to show what he had caught, and Chester bent forward to look at it with him, the 2 of them studying the small light in the glass, and Frances watched them and felt the feeling she had been learning to feel without apology or restraint, which was happiness, simple and absolute and entirely her own, made better by being shared, made permanent by being chosen. She would keep this land for the rest of her life. She would keep this man. She would keep this life she had refused to leave, that had refused to leave her, that had grown around her stubbornness and her precision and her dark years and her mother's apple tree, that had made room, as lives do when they are honest, for something she had not known to plan for. Chester Prescott had won the land in a bet he had not placed, from a man who had no right to wager it, and he had ridden up a lane in September to claim what was legally his and found a woman who would not move and a situation that was not what he had purchased and a choice that was not easy and had made it anyway, had made it right, had made it into this. The stars came out fully now over Kansas, the same enormous sky that had watched over this land through every season of every year, the same grass, the same wind, the same creek running south to find the river. And on the porch of the house at the center of it all, the Prescotts sat together as the evening deepened around them, complete.